On the morning of May the 12th, 1943, a lone fisherman off the coast of Norway spotted something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Through the thick Atlantic fog emerged a silhouette so massive, so menacing, that he immediately cut his nets and turned his small vessel toward shore. What he had witnessed was no ordinary warship. It was the Tirpitz, Adolf Hitler's most prized naval asset, and perhaps the most hunted vessel in the entire Second World War. The fisherman's hands trembled as he steered through the mist. He knew the stories whispered in the taverns along the fjord's tales of a floating fortress that struck terror into the hearts of Allied naval commanders without ever firing a shot in open battle. This was the ship that Winston Churchill called the Beast and ordered destroyed at any cost. Yet here she sat, hidden in the remote waters of Kefjord in northern Norway, protected by mountains, smoke screens, and anti-aircraft batteries that formed an almost impenetrable shield. The Tirpitz was not just any battleship. Sister ship to the legendary Bismarck, she displaced over 52,000 tons fully loaded and stretched 823 feet from bow to stern. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton over distances exceeding 20 miles. Below her armored decks, a crew of 2,500 men lived in a floating city complete with a bakery, a cinema, and even a sauna. But her true power lay not in her guns or her armor, it was in her mere existence. According to documents preserved in the British National Archives, as referenced in historian David Woodward's comprehensive work, The Secret Raiders, the British Admiralty dedicated enormous resources to tracking and attempting to destroy this single vessel. The reason was strategic psychology. As long as the Tirpitz remained operational, the Royal Navy was forced to maintain a substantial fleet in northern waters to counter any potential sortie. Convoys carrying vital supplies to the Soviet Union through the Arctic had to be heavily escorted, diverting ships desperately needed elsewhere. The Tirpitz was a fleet in being, a threat so potent that it shaped Allied naval strategy across entire oceans without ever leaving her protected anchorage. The ship's commander, Captain Hans Meyer, understood this perfectly. He walked the deck that May morning, watching his crew conduct their endless drills. Meyer was a career naval officer who had served in the Imperial German Navy during the First World War. He knew that his ship's greatest weapon was the fear she inspired, the calculations she forced upon the enemy. Every day the Tirpitz remained afloat was a victory of sorts, tying down Allied resources that could otherwise be used against German U-boats or in support of operations in the Mediterranean or Pacific. Yet Meyer also knew that this strategy made his ship the most hunted target in naval warfare. British intelligence devoted entire departments to tracking her movements. Reconnaissance aircraft risked anti-aircraft fire to photograph her berth. Commandos trained for suicide missions to sink her. The Tirpitz was simultaneously Germany's greatest naval asset and most vulnerable prize, a secret worth protecting at any cost and a target worth any sacrifice to destroy. In the underground war rooms beneath London, Winston Churchill stabbed his finger at a reconnaissance photograph spread across the mahogany table. The date was September the 6th, 1942, and the Prime Minister's frustration had reached a boiling point. The photograph showed the Tirpitz nestled in Fenford, surrounded by protective netting and smoke generators. For months, this single ship had dictated the movement of a significant portion of Britain's home fleet. "Gentlemen," Churchill growled to the assembled officers of the Admiralty, "the destruction of the Tirpitz is the greatest single act which would improve the war situation at sea. No other target is comparable to it." His words, later recorded in his war memoirs, reflected a fixation that bordered on obsession. The Prime Minister understood naval strategy intimately. He had served as First Lord of the Admiralty during both World Wars, and he knew that conventional wisdom about battleship supremacy was being rewritten by aircraft carriers and submarines. Yet here was a battleship that mattered more than any carrier group. The challenge facing the Royal Navy was unprecedented. The Tirpitz was not at sea where she could be engaged by surface vessels or carrier aircraft. She was tucked into narrow Norwegian fjords, surrounded by steep mountains that made aerial attack nearly impossible. Anti-aircraft batteries lined the shores. Torpedo nets protected her hull. Smoke generators could blanket the entire area within minutes of an air raid warning. German fighter squadrons stationed nearby could intercept attackers before they reached their target. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord, knew that conventional methods had already failed. In March of 1942, British bombers had attempted to destroy the Tirpitz during a raid on Fenford. Despite numerous sorties, not a single bomb had struck the battleship. The Germans had simply activated their smoke screens, and the attacking aircraft had been forced to bomb blindly through impenetrable clouds of artificial fog. Several aircraft were lost to flak. The Tirpitz remained unscathed. The situation grew more desperate with each passing month. In July of 1942, the mere threat of the Tirpitz had contributed to the catastrophic dispersal of convoy PQ-17. This Arctic convoy, carrying war supplies to the Soviet Union, had been ordered to scatter when British intelligence reported that the German battleship had put to sea. Though the Tirpitz turned back without engaging, the scattered convoy ships became easy prey for U-boats and aircraft. 24 of 35 merchant vessels were sunk, along with over 400 tanks, more than 200 aircraft, and 3,500 vehicles desperately needed by Soviet forces fighting the Wehrmacht. Churchill demanded action. The Admiralty began exploring unconventional options. One scheme involved training Miite submarines, tiny vessels manned by crews of 4 to penetrate the fjord defenses and attach explosive charges directly to the battleship's hull. Another proposal suggested using Norwegian resistance fighters to sabotage the ship from within, though how civilians could access such a heavily guarded target remained unclear. A third option involved developing special bombs capable of penetrating the Tirpitz's armored deck from high altitude. Meanwhile, aboard the battleship herself, life continued in an odd mixture of tension and monotony. The crew knew they were the most wanted ship in Hitler's navy. They drilled constantly, preparing for action that never came. Morale suffered from the isolation of their Norwegian exile. Some sailors called their ship the Lonely Queen of the North. Others, more cynically, referred to her as the world's most expensive hotel. They conducted exercises, painted bulkheads, wrote letters home, and wondered if they would ever see actual combat, or if they would spend the entire war as bait in a massive trap. Captain Meyer received regular intelligence reports about British intentions. German naval intelligence had broken several British codes and knew that Churchill personally demanded the Tirpitz's destruction. Meyer increased security protocols. He varied the timing of drills and crew rotations to prevent patterns that British intelligence might exploit. He worked with Luftwaffe commanders to ensure fighter protection remained constant. Most importantly, he maintained the smoke screen system that could render his ship invisible within 3 minutes. On the night of September the 20th, 1943, 6 tiny vessels slipped through the dark waters off the Norwegian coast. Each X-craft Miite submarine was only 51 feet long and according to official British Admiralty records, compiled in post-war analyses of special operations. 3 of the 6 X-craft made it through the outer defenses. X-5 was lost with all hands, probably destroyed by German patrol boats. X-8 had developed mechanical problems and been forced to abort. X-9 had broken loose from her towing submarine during the approach and sank in deep water. That left X-5, X-6, and X-7 to complete the mission. Inside X-7, the air grew thick and foul. Carbon dioxide levels rose as the 4-man crew breathed and rebreathed the limited atmosphere. The submarine's electric motors hummed quietly as Place maneuvered through the inner defenses. Through his periscope, he could now see the Tirpitz herself, massive and menacing even from a distance. The battleship was moored close to shore, surrounded by anti-torpedo nets and with patrol boats constantly circling. Place checked his charts one final time, then ordered his crew to prepare the explosive charges. Each X-craft carried 2 side cargo containers, each loaded with 2 tons of Amatol high explosive. The plan was to slip beneath the Tirpitz's anti-torpedo nets, maneuver under the battleship's hull, release the charges with time delay fuses, and escape before detonation. It was, everyone involved understood, essentially a suicide mission with a slim chance of survival. Lieutenant Donald Cameron commanded X-6, the second submarine to reach the target area. Cameron, just 27 years old, had volunteered for special operations after spending months on conventional submarine patrols in the Mediterranean. He found the monotony unbearable. He wanted action. Now, as he approached the tear pits through water that seemed to press in from all sides, he wondered if he had been too eager in his youth. Cameron's approach went wrong almost immediately. X-6 became entangled in anti-submarine nets and had to surface repeatedly to free herself. German lookouts spotted the periscope and raised the alarm. Within minutes, patrol boats converged on the area, depth charges began exploding, and searchlights swept the water. Cameron made a desperate decision. Rather than abort, he forced his way through the nets, submerged directly beneath the tear pits, released his explosive charges with the timers set for 1 hour, and surfaced to surrender his crew. They would not escape, but perhaps their sacrifice would accomplish the mission. Place in X-7 also encountered the nets. His submarine became hopelessly entangled while trying to maneuver beneath the battleship. After struggling for nearly an hour, with his crew on the verge of suffocation from bad air, Place ordered the charges released and brought his craft to the surface. German sailors on the Tirpitz's deck watched in astonishment as the tiny submarine broke the surface less than 200 yards from their hull. Place and one other crew member survived to be captured. The other 2 men went down with X-7 when she finally sank. At precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of September the 22nd, 1943, the Tirpitz shuddered as if struck by an earthquake. 2 massive explosions erupted beneath her hull, lifting the 52,000-ton battleship several feet out of the water and slamming her back down with a force that buckled steel plates and shattered equipment throughout the ship. Aboard the vessel, Captain Meyer grabbed a bulkhead to steady himself as the deck heaved beneath his feet. His worst nightmare had come true. The enemy had found a way through his defenses. The explosions from X-6 and X-7's charges detonated almost simultaneously, creating a combined blast of 8 tons of high explosive directly beneath the battleship's hull. The Tirpitz's armor belt was designed to withstand shells striking from the side, not mines detonating beneath her keel. Water erupted in twin geysers higher than the ship's superstructure. Every man aboard felt the concussion in his bones. Damage control teams raced through the ship, assessing the catastrophe. The news was grim. All 3 engine rooms were flooded. The starboard propeller shaft was twisted beyond repair. Fuel tanks had ruptured, spilling oil into the bilges and surrounding water. The port rudder was jammed. Most critically, the ship's hull had been breached in multiple locations. Though the Tirpitz remained afloat, her subdivision into watertight compartments had saved her from capsizing. She was crippled. Captain Meyer knew immediately that his ship would not put to sea again for many months, if ever. In London, confirmation of the attack's success took days to arrive. British intelligence pieced together fragments from Norwegian resistance reports, German radio intercepts, and reconnaissance photographs. When Churchill received the news, witnesses reported that he permitted himself a rare smile. The beast had been wounded. Though not sunk, the Tirpitz was out of action. Arctic convoys could sail with reduced escorts. Ships could be redeployed to other theaters. The psychological stranglehold the German battleship had maintained was broken. The human cost, however, had been severe. Of the 12 submariners who crewed X-6 and X-7, 6 were killed or missing. Lieutenants Cameron and Place survived captivity and were both awarded the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest decoration for valor. The citation for Place's medal, preserved in the National Archives, noted that his courage and determination in the face of almost certain death exemplified the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. For the Germans, the attack exposed humiliating vulnerabilities. Hitler demanded an investigation into how enemy submarines had penetrated supposedly impenetrable defenses. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy, ordered sweeping changes to security procedures at all Norwegian anchorages. Anti-submarine nets were doubled. Hydrophone coverage was extended. Patrol boat schedules were randomized. Guards were tripled. But the damage was done, both to the ship and to German naval prestige. Repair crews descended upon the Tirpitz immediately. Thousands of workers were brought to the remote Norwegian fjord. Specialized equipment had to be transported hundreds of miles over primitive roads or brought in by sea. Steel plates were manufactured in German factories and shipped north. Welders worked in shifts around the clock. The repairs would take 6 months under optimal conditions, and conditions in northern Norway during winter were far from optimal. Meanwhile, British planners recognized that a wounded beast was still a beast. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were determined to repair the Tirpitz and return her to operational status. Churchill's obsession rekindled. If the ship could not be sunk by unconventional means, then perhaps conventional bombing could finish what the Meade submarines had started. The Royal Air Force was consulted. Could heavy bombers reach the Norwegian fjords? Could they carry weapons powerful enough to penetrate the battleship's armor? The answer came from an unlikely source. Barnes Wallis, the engineer who had designed the bouncing bomb used in the famous Dambusters raid. Wallis proposed a new weapon, the Tallboy, a 5-ton earthquake bomb designed to penetrate deep into the earth before exploding, creating shockwaves that would destroy underground bunkers. Wallis theorized that if dropped from sufficient altitude, the Tallboy could also penetrate a battleship's armored deck. The Air Ministry authorized development and production. The Tirpitz had gained a temporary reprieve, but her executioner was being forged in British factories. On the night of April 3, 1944, squadron leader James Tate gathered his crews in a dimly lit briefing room at RF Lossiemouth in Scotland. The men of 617th Squadron were veterans of dozens of bombing missions over Germany, but tonight's target was different. Tate pulled back the curtain covering a large map, revealing the long route to northern Norway. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we're going after the Tirpitz." The room erupted in murmurs. Every man present knew the battleship's reputation. They also knew that attacking a heavily defended target in a Norwegian fjord, over 1,000 miles from their base, pushed the Lancaster bomber to its absolute operational limits. The aircraft would be loaded with the new Tallboy bomb's massive 5-ton weapons that required special modifications to carry. Fuel would be calculated to the gallon. There would be no margin for error, no possibility of diversion if weather or enemy action complicated the mission. Tate himself was only 26 years old, but he commanded respect earned through 34 previous operations over Germany. He understood the skeptical looks he was receiving. "I know what you're thinking," he continued. "The distance is extreme. The defenses are formidable, and we'll be attacking in broad daylight because we need visibility to aim these special weapons. But intelligence confirms the Tirpitz is still under repair. She's vulnerable. We may never get a better chance." The Lancaster bombers that would carry the Tallboy bombs represented the pinnacle of British heavy bomber development. Each aircraft stretched 69 feet long with a wingspan of 102 feet. Powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the Lancaster could carry heavier bomb loads than any other Allied bomber. But even these capable aircraft had to be specially modified to accommodate the Tallboy. The bomb bay doors were removed entirely, and the bombs would hang partially exposed beneath the fuselage. The operation, codenamed Paravan, launched on September 15, 1944. 28 Lancaster bombers, each carrying a single Tallboy bomb, took off from bases in Scotland and northern England. The flight north was tedious and tense. The heavily laden bombers climbed slowly, fuel consumption carefully monitored. Over the North Sea they formed up and set course for Norway. Fighter escort was impossible at such range. They would be on their own. As the formation approached the Norwegian coast, the weather deteriorated. Clouds obscured the mountains. Visibility dropped to near zero. Tate faced a critical decision: press on and bomb through clouds with no guarantee of hitting the target, or abort the mission and return with bombs still aboard, wasting precious fuel and the element of surprise. He checked his instruments, consulted with his navigator, and made the call. They would continue to the target and bomb using the new Mark 14 bomb sight, which incorporated radar assistance for cloud penetration. The Lancasters climbed to 20,000 feet as they approached Kufjord. Below them, hidden by clouds, the Tirpitz's crew had detected the approaching bombers on radar. Alarms sounded throughout the ship. Gun crews raced to their stations. The smokescreen generators roared to life, pumping out dense white clouds that mixed with the natural overcast to create impenetrable cover. Captain Meyer, who had been ashore inspecting repair work, rushed back to his command. Tate's bombardier, peering through the Mark 14 sight, could see nothing but clouds and smoke. The radar return gave them a rough position for the battleship, but the tallboy required precision. These were not area effect weapons like the thousands of smaller bombs dropped on German cities. Each tallboy cost the British economy dearly in resources and labor. Each had to count. Tate held his aircraft steady at 20,000 feet, trusting his crew and his equipment. "Bomb release," the bombardier called. The Lancaster lifted noticeably as 5 tons of steel and explosive dropped away. 28 tallboy bombs fell through the clouds and smoke toward the tear pits that September morning. The bombs reached terminal velocity, their streamlined shapes cutting through air that grew denser as they plummeted. One bomb struck directly, penetrating the battleship's forward deck and exploding deep in her bow. The effect was catastrophic. The entire forward section of the ship was gutted. 52 crewmen died instantly. Several near misses created the earthquake effect Valise had predicted, lifting the massive hull and smashing it back down with force that buckled internal structures. Yet somehow, impossibly, the tear pits remained afloat. Her subdivision into watertight compartments again saved her from capsizing, though the damage was far worse than anything inflicted by the Miite submarines. This time, there could be no doubt, the battleship would never sail again. She could not even move under her own power. But Hitler, in his obsession with prestige weapons, refused to admit defeat. If the tear pits could not sail, she would become a floating fortress, a stationary battery protecting northern Norway from Allied invasion. In the autumn of 1944, the crippled tear pits was towed south to Tromsk, a move that Captain Meyer protested bitterly. Kufjord had been deep inland, protected by mountains and distance from Allied airfields. Tromsk, while still in northern Norway, was more accessible to British bombers. Meyer argued that moving the ship would simply make her easier to destroy. His superiors overruled him. The battleship would be positioned in shallow water off Kia Island, where she could serve as a coastal defense battery even if permanently immobile. The logic was pure desperation dressed as strategy. Germany was losing the war on all fronts. The Wehrmacht was retreating in the east, had been driven from France in the west, and was being pounded day and night by Allied bombers. The once mighty Kriegsmarine had been reduced to U-boats and a handful of surface vessels that barely dared leave port. The Tirpitz, even crippled and stationary, represented one of the few remaining symbols of German naval power. Hitler would not authorize her scrapping, no matter how logical that decision might be. The move to Tromsk took weeks. Tugs hauled the powerless battleship southward through Norwegian coastal waters, past stark mountains and silent fjords. The ship that had once been Hitler's pride now limped like a wounded elephant toward what everyone aboard knew would be her final anchorage. When they arrived at Kia, the Tirpitz was positioned in deliberately shallow water, so shallow that if she were sunk, her superstructure would remain above water and her guns could still be fired. It was an admission that sinking was inevitable, combined with determination to extract one last use from the vessel. Anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened around the new position. Additional flak batteries were installed on shore and on the ship herself. Fighter squadrons were put on high alert. Intelligence officers briefed the crew that British bombers would certainly attempt to finish what they had started. The question was not if another attack would come, but when and whether the defenses would be sufficient to prevent the ship's final destruction. Life aboard the Tirpitz had become surreal. The crew of 2,500 men lived on what was essentially a grounded hulk. There would be no more drills preparing for high-speed maneuvers. No more rehearsals of gun battles with enemy battleships. The ship's powerful engines, which had once been capable of propelling her at over 30 knots, were dead. Many systems had been stripped for parts needed elsewhere. The luxuries that had made the Tirpitz a floating city, the cinema, the bakery, the recreational facilities, had been sacrificed to make room for additional ammunition storage and emergency repairs. Maya walked his damaged ship each morning, inspecting the work crews who labored constantly to patch the most critical damage. He knew their efforts were ultimately futile. The British would come again. The distance from Scotland to Tromsk was shorter than to Kefjord. The weather would eventually cooperate with the attackers. And when that day came, the Tirpitz had nowhere to run. She would fight from her static position or die. Most likely she would do both. The crew's morale deteriorated as autumn deepened into winter. Letters from home brought increasingly desperate news. German cities were being reduced to rubble by American daylight bombing and British night raids. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Everyone could sense the war was lost, yet they remained aboard this doomed vessel in Arctic Norway, waiting for an end they could neither prevent nor escape. Some sailors requested transfers. Meyer approved what few he could, but most were denied by higher command. The Tirpitz needed her crew, pointless as that need had become. In Britain, RAF planners were indeed preparing to return. The attack in September had proven the Tallboy could damage even a battleship as heavily armored as the Tirpitz. The move to Tromsk had actually made the target more vulnerable. The distance was manageable for the Lancasters even with their massive bomb loads. Squadron leader Tate began planning what he hoped would be the final mission against the Beast. Weather remained the critical variable. The Arctic autumn brought storms and endless clouds. Attacking through overcast had produced limited results. Another direct strike required clear visibility. Tate's crews trained continuously, practicing formation flying and bomb-aiming procedures. They studied photographs of the Tirpitz at her new anchorage. They calculated fuel loads and approach vectors. And they waited for the weather to clear. The wait extended through October. Storm after storm swept down from the Arctic, bringing snow and gale-force winds. November arrived with no improvement. Tate checked weather forecasts obsessively. His crews were ready. His aircraft were loaded. Everything depended on nature, cooperating long enough for a single clear day over northern Norway. Finally, on November the 11th, 1944, meteorologists predicted a break in the weather. A high-pressure system would move across Scandinavia, bringing clear skies that might last 24 hours. It was enough. Tate gave the order to prepare for takeoff. The morning of November the 12th, 1944, broke cold and clear over northern Norway. Aboard the Tirpitz, sailors emerging on deck for the morning watch saw something they had not witnessed in weeks: blue sky. Stars were still visible in the pre-dawn darkness to the east. The visibility was exceptional. One veteran petty officer looked up at the perfect weather and muttered a curse. Perfect weather meant perfect bombing conditions. Captain Meyer received the meteorological report with grim resignation. He ordered all gun crews to their stations and sent an urgent request to Luftwaffe headquarters for fighter protection. The response was not encouraging. Most fighter squadrons in Norway had been redeployed to Germany to defend against the endless streams of American and British bombers attacking the homeland. Only a handful of fighters remained in the north, and most of those were grounded by mechanical problems. The Tirpitz would face the coming attack with only her own anti-aircraft guns and perhaps a few supporting batteries on shore. At RAF stations in Scotland, 32 Lancaster bombers were already airborne. Squadron leader Tate led the formation north, navigating by dead reckoning across the North Sea. The sun rose behind them as they crossed the Norwegian coast, illuminating the snow-covered mountains in golden light. The visibility was indeed exceptional. Tate could see for 50 miles in every direction. They would have no problem finding the target. The question was whether the Germans would have enough warning to generate effective smoke screens. The formation climbed to 14,000 feet for the bombing run. This was lower than the 20,000 feet used in the September attack, but Tate wanted to ensure accuracy. The Tallboy bombs had proven their potential. Now they needed to achieve decisive results. Each Lancaster carried one of the massive weapons along with standard bombs as backup. The aircrew could see the Tromsk area from 30 miles away. The clear weather was almost too good, giving German defenders ample warning. At 9:40 in the morning, air raid sirens began wailing across the Tirpitz. Radar had detected the incoming formation. Gun crews, already at their stations, tracked the approaching bombers with practiced precision. The ship's main armament, those massive 15-inch guns that had never fired at an enemy vessel, were useless against aircraft, but the Tirpitz bristled with smaller anti-aircraft weapons. 8.8mm flak guns opened up first, throwing up a curtain of exploding shells. Smaller caliber guns added their firepower, filling the sky with tracer fire. Meyer stood on the bridge, watching the Lancasters approach. They came on steadily, maintaining perfect formation despite the flak. No fighter aircraft rose to intercept them. The smokescreen generators roared to life, but the wind was wrong. Instead of concealing the battleship, the smoke blew parallel to her length, marking her position for the bombardiers above. Meyer felt a strange calm settle over him. He had done everything possible to protect his ship. Now the outcome was in fate's hands, or perhaps in God's, and Meyer was not certain there was a difference. Tate's bombardier acquired the target easily. The Tirpitz lay in the clear water, her distinctive profile unmistakable even from 3 miles up. "Bomb doors open!" Tate ordered. The Lancaster lurched as the partially exposed tallboy was fully released from its cradle. All around him, other bombers were releasing their weapons. 32 5-ton bombs began falling toward the battleship below. The tallboy bombs reached terminal velocity quickly. Their streamlined shape and massive weight accelerated them to speeds approaching 700 miles per hour faster than sound. From the Tirpitz, sailors heard the bombs coming before they saw them, a rising shriek that grew louder until it seemed to split the sky. Then the impacts began. The first bomb struck the ship amidships, penetrating the armored deck and exploding deep inside. The blast gutted 3 decks and killed everyone in the sections immediately adjacent to the impact. Before damage control teams could even respond, a second bomb struck forward, blowing away the entire bow section. A third bomb hit near the stern. Each explosion was accompanied by a shockwave that rippled through the ship's steel bones. Meyer was thrown from his feet by the third impact. When he regained his footing, he knew immediately that his ship was dying. The deck was tilting beneath him, already listing to port. Reports flooded in from all sections: flooding, fires, casualties. The list increased rapidly. 10 degrees, 15 degrees, 20 degrees. All hands abandon ship, Meyer ordered. It was already too late for many. The Tirpitz capsized 12 minutes after the first bomb struck. The massive battleship rolled to port with an almost graceful inevitability, her hull breaching the surface like a surfacing whale before continuing over. Men scrambled up the tilting deck, desperate to reach the high starboard side before the ship completed her death roll. Many succeeded, many did not. The ship's chaplain, Pastor Ernst Eichhoff, refused to leave, choosing instead to remain below decks ministering to the wounded who could not be moved. He went down with the ship. Nearly 1,000 men died when the Tirpitz capsized. Some were trapped below decks when watertight doors were sealed to slow the flooding. Others were pulled under by the suction as the massive hull rolled over. A few were killed by falling debris or secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off in the fires. The survivors who made it off the ship before she capsized found themselves in water so cold that most would die of hypothermia within minutes. Rescue boats from shore saved those they could reach, but the toll was horrific. Captain Meyer survived. He was one of the last men to leave the bridge, stepping off onto the exposed hull as it continued to roll. He swam to shore and stood on the beach at Keya Island watching his ship die. The Tirpitz's keel protruded from the water at an obscene angle, her propellers exposed to the air. Smoke poured from the wreck. Secondary explosions continued for hours as fires reached magazine spaces. Meyer's career was over. The beast was finally dead. In London, Winston Churchill received the news of the Tirpitz's destruction with profound satisfaction. For 3 years, this single ship had dominated his strategic thinking about the naval war in northern waters. According to his private secretary's diary, preserved in the Churchill Archives Center at Cambridge University, the Prime Minister's first words upon hearing the confirmation were simply, "At last, the obsession that had driven so many desperate missions was finally satisfied." The human cost of destroying the Tirpitz had been substantial. 6 submariners died in the Meade submarine attack. Multiple bomber crews were lost in the various air raids. Nearly 1,000 German sailors perished when the ship finally capsized. Whether the strategic benefit justified this cost remains debated by historians to this day. What is indisputable is that the Tirpitz, despite never sinking an enemy warship in combat, shaped the naval war in ways few other vessels could claim. The wreck of the Tirpitz remained at Tromsk for years after the war. Norwegian salvage companies eventually cut up the hull for scrap metal, a process that took nearly a decade. Some sections were simply too massive to move and remain on the seabed today. Divers occasionally explore the fragments, finding artifacts from a ship that once represented the pinnacle of naval engineering and became instead a symbol of strategic miscalculation. For the surviving crew members, the loss of the Tirpitz marked the end of their war. Most became prisoners of war, held in Norwegian or British camps until hostilities ended in May of 1945. Meyer himself spent 6 months in captivity before being repatriated to Germany. He found his homeland destroyed, its cities rubble, its people defeated and disillusioned. The Grand Navy he had served no longer existed. In his later years, Meyer wrote his memoirs, reflecting on the irony of commanding a ship so powerful that it shaped the war without ever firing its main guns in anger.